caught communicating, and inevitably it created some more punishment.
Communicate. Communication was our lifeblood. You had to communicate.
The Vietnam War was fought between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The war started in 1955 and ended in 1975. The U.S. did not send troops into the conflict right away. Instead, they entered in 1965. The Vietnam War is mostly known for the American reaction of sending troops overseas, but there was a lot more than just that happened. Both sides of the war took prisoners, and the ones lucky enough to return home have brought terrifying stories along with them. In the prisons, the North Vietnamese tortured the Americans to try to get information out of them. Life in the prisons was inhumane. The prisoners could not fight back against the guards physically. Instead, they fought back by learning to communicate with their fellow prisoners despite the danger of being caught. In 1964, North Vietnam took their first prisoner of war, Everett Alvarez. Everett was taken prisoner just after the U.S. activated its troops in Vietnam. Alvarez was taken prisoner after his plane was shot down while helping a U.S. destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin. Many other pilots suffered the same fate as Alvarez. Once at the prison, the POWs were brought to an interrogation room where a high-ranking Vietnamese official would ask them questions about what they were doing in their last mission. Anyone who refused to answer the questions was punished. The North Vietnamese tried to get the prisoners to confess what they had done so they could use it for propaganda. During one of these sessions, the North Vietnamese tried to get Jeremiah Denton to say that the prisons were humane and that the North Vietnamese were treating them well.
I get adequate food and adequate clothing and medical care when I require it.
How do you think about so-called definite law? Do you think that's present about it?
Well, I don't know what is happening, but whatever the position of my government is, I support it fully.
During his interview, he blinked in Morse code the word torture. He made sure that all of his answers in the interview were what they wanted him to say, so they would air it live later that night for all to see. Navy intelligence picked up on the code and were able to send it to the commanders and officers to show that the North Vietnamese were torturing their prisoners. One of the main reasons prisoners got punished was communication. The North Vietnamese wanted the prisoners to feel lonely and forgotten, so talking to each other was quickly shut down. Many forms of communication were used and discovered by the North Vietnamese until they made the mistake of putting Captain Carl Harris, Lieutenant Philip Butler, and Lieutenant Robert Schumacher in the same cell. The three prisoners knew that what they were doing was dangerous. They knew the consequences of being caught, but they also knew how important it was to communicate with fellow prisoners. With a burnt matchstick, they inscribed a 5x5 table with all the letters of the alphabet on a piece of toilet paper. The chart they made was a form of communication known as tap code. Prisoners would follow the chart in tap letters and would make up words to communicate with fellow soldiers. Many acronyms were used, that way sentences did not get too long. The three tested it out in their own cell and realized that when the chart was memorized, they could pass it around the prison. The North Vietnamese guards heard the tapping and went to investigate. They noticed nothing wrong, but decided to separate the three men. They were split apart and put on different sides of the prison. They then taught their new cellmates the code, and not too long after, almost everyone in the prison knew how to use the tap code. They used this code to talk about a great number of things. They could talk about family life, what they had been doing in the war up till this point, and what the North Vietnamese guards were doing to them. If they had been tortured, they would tap for the cells around them to hear. With the introduction of tap code, the prisoners finally received something that they had never had since their captivity: high morale. Up to this point, they had been separated, beaten, and alone. But now, they could pull together to have hope that they would one day be released. Many U.S. soldiers were taken prisoner of war during the Vietnam War. They lived in terrible conditions as well as living in the constant fear of not knowing what was going on in the prison or happening in the war itself. Orson Swindle was no exception. Orson was flying a mission over North Vietnam when his plane was shot down. He ejected and slowly fell onto a large field where North Vietnamese people were waiting. When he landed, they beat him up to ensure he could not escape them. He was then given to the North Vietnamese, where he was brought to the main prison in Hanoi. Upon his arrival to the prison, he was immediately interrogated, and in this session, he learned what it was like to be a prisoner of the Vietnam War. He was able to get out of the first session without suffering too much. He was then brought to his cell and learned very quickly how life would be from then on. His cell was very dirty, it would not be cleaned out his entire time in the prison. The food was terrible, and he was treated badly as well. During his time as a prisoner, he was moved from prison to prison. He ended back in Hanoi. When he had left the Hanoi prison, people would need to wait for the guards to leave, and they would start whispering. When arriving back, he noticed that no one was talking. Everyone was tapping. He quickly picked up on it and started tapping along with everyone else. Orson stated that communication with fellow prisoners was something that everyone had to do to ensure their survival through the tough times ahead.
Communication was our lifeblood. You had to communicate.
When the last troops had been pulled out of Vietnam, most of the prisoners in North Vietnam were freed, and only a few remained. A year after the withdrawal, Richard Nixon declared that all the troops, including the prisoners, had been freed from Vietnam with great honor. Out of the 2,500 total troops thought of as missing in action, only 1,600 were accounted for. A total of 687 U.S. prisoners were released after the war, with around 50 having died from the torture and inhumane conditions that they had been living in. The longest held prisoner was Captain Floyd Thompson, who was captured on March 26, 1964. He was held in prison for roughly 9 years of his life. For most prisoners, communication with their fellow prisoners is what kept them going. The Vietnam War may have gone on for 19 years, but in that time, some people's lives changed forever. The North Vietnamese did not give the names of all the people they held, so anyone who was taken prisoner was labeled MIA, missing in action. When they freed the POWs, it helped the government determine who was missing in action and who had been a prisoner. During the war, the treatment of U.S. prisoner of wars was brought up, but the North Vietnamese stated that because it had not been declared a war, the Geneva Convention could not be brought up. People may think that after the war, the treatment of prisoners would have been rethought again, but it never was. The U.S. was tried for a few war crimes that involved the lives of innocent North Vietnamese. In 1991, the U.S. and a small group of allies declared war against Iraq. The conflict lasted for a month, and in that time, 23 U.S. prisoners were taken. They were treated just as badly as the POWs in Vietnam. In the beginning, they were tortured and put in terrible living conditions. Guantanamo Bay is another example of prisoner mistreatment. Guantanamo Bay is currently being used as a prison for around 20 criminals. The prison has seen around 775 total prisoners. The prisoners were tortured and lived in terrible conditions. As we can see, not much has changed in the way POWs are treated, even after the Geneva Convention in 1949 and in Vietnam. This just goes to show that through communication, past POWs have made us all realize that the treatment of future prisoners needs to change.